Hi. So you're interested in Greek paganism, and you've read your Edith Hamilton and you've read your Bullfinch, and now you need to know where you want to go next. There's an awful lot of information out there, an awful lot of books, and now you're wondering what books you should go to. You can pretty much divide the information up into two categories, the primary sources and the secondary sources. The primary sources being those that have been produced by the actual ancient Greeks themselves, and the secondary sources, those that were produced by the modern scholars. You want to be familiar with both of them. A lot of people ignore the primary sources, or they just aren't aware of the good secondary sources. So you want to be familiar with both of those. Let me start with the primary sources. The Greeks didn't have anything you could call scripture, but the closest they would have been Hesiod's Theogony and the Homeric hymns. This lovely little book has both of those in it. This is the Loeb Classical Library edition. Contains Hesiod, the Homeric hymns, the epic cycle, Homerica, a number of fragments of it, as well as Hesiod's Theogony. It also contains his works and days. I really like this particular edition, partly because it contains both Hesiod and the Homeric hymns in one nice small book here, partly because it's the Loeb Classical Library edition, and they're fairly well thought of. One advantage to them is that they have the Greek on one side and the English on the other. Now, you may not know Greek, I don't myself, but it's useful having the Greek here because in the Greek they actually use the capital letters for proper names, and you can find exactly what corresponds to them in the English, and that way you can tell exactly which line you're in. Now, the reason that matters is when you read a secondary source, they will reference Theogony line so-and-so, and you can find out exactly which line it is in the Greek, and then figure out where that line is in the English by comparing the proper nouns. So that can be quite useful, and maybe someday you will learn Greek, and this will help you learn it. So I really like the Loeb Classical Library editions. Hesiod's Theogony tells the story of the beginnings of the cosmos and how the gods were born. Works and Days is a set of advice to his brother, mostly on farming, but which sounds like it's not that relevant to paganism, but actually it's very relevant because farming involves a lot of dealings with the gods. The Homeric hymns were not so much hymns as they were sort of like stories of the gods that would have been told before other stories, sort of like an introduction. They do, however, include some of the really important myths, such as the one about the kidnapping of Persephone by Hades. So they're extremely important to be familiar with. So this is the particular edition I recommend for that. You definitely need to be familiar with both Hesiod and the Homeric hymns. You're also going to want to read, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey. It doesn't much matter which translation you read. I recommend getting one that is told in a poetic form, if for no other reason than that's because of what it was told in originally, and you'll get a better idea for the feel of what it was told. I don't recommend one that's particularly heavily poetic. Please stay away from anything that's told in a pseudo-Shakespearean style. That is just silly. By the way, in the description I'll give the actual references to the translations I'm using, but in most cases it doesn't much matter. The Iliad is the story of part of the Trojan War. I was a little disappointed the first time I read it to discover it wasn't most or all of the Trojan War. It doesn't include, for instance, the story of the Trojan horse. It's just a piece of it. It does include a fair amount about how the Greeks saw their gods, how they related to their gods. There is some ritual material, such as funeral material, in it. The Odyssey, I think, is a much better story, and it also includes some ritual materials, description of sacrifices, a really nice description of a ritual to the dead as well. And also just a great feel for how somebody might relate to a particular god or goddess. This is Pausanias' description of Greece. It's 4 volumes in the Loeb Classical Library edition. Pausanias was a tourist, essentially. He went through Greece and wrote a tourist guide. This is the Fromers of his day. And he'd go from town to town and he would say, this town has these temples in it to these particular deities. And most of it, what he wrote was about the temples. And he would tell you about the myths and how the temples were built and what deities they were to and if there were any interesting sacrifices there. So it gives you a really good idea for which deities were worshipped where, and also the local variants. And that's a very important thing about ancient Greece. You get the impression reading like Edith Hamilton and Bulfinch that the same deities were worshipped the same way throughout all of Greece and all the same stories were told about them, but that just wasn't true. And Pausanias is a really good corrective to that. A lot of what we know about the Greeks comes from Athens, and so we get a feeling to this is the way it was. But Pausanias gives you a real feel for the way that different parts of Greece worshipped gods in different ways. He also gives you a great feel for the fact that the gods were known by titles. Apollo Far Shooter is a very famous example, but you run across other ones in here for various places. It's actually a very good read. Every now and then he goes into the history of a particular place, which I just sort of skimmed. But all in all, it's just I found it to be a great read. You'll run across references to him everywhere, so sooner or later you're going to have to read them. Finally, this is the history of Apollodorus, the library of Apollodorus. This particular one is titled The Gods and Heroes of the Greeks, but it's Apollodorus' library. It's exactly who this was written for is kind of confusing. It's kind of a summary of various myths, like it was written for students almost, like Cliff Notes. Some places it's more full than others. Some places it is sort of Cliff Notey. Sometimes it'll give you fairly good versions of it. The descriptions of Heracles' labors are particularly interesting, but other times you get things like Istris married Hippodamia, Chalcedon Rudea, Agenor Cleopatra, Chytus Asteria, and so on. So some parts of it are pretty bloody boring, and you just sort of rush through to get to the interesting parts. Other parts are fascinating and very useful. This particular edition is interesting because it gives, in footnotes, it gives variants from other sources. But it's also kind of weird because the author was a Freudian. Well, the translator was a Freudian, and he gives Freudian interpretations of a lot of the myths, which is intriguing, shall we say. Basically, he's interpreting Greek myths with his own mythology. So this can be a very useful addition if you ignore the Freudianism. This book I was very lucky to find. The daughter of some friends of ours went to a college in the town, and she used this in a course, and when she was done with the course I bought it from her. It's called Anthology of Classical Myth, Primary Sources and Translation. Again, the full version is in the description. It's a collection of excerpts from various sources from Greece and Rome, and some of these are from the other ones. There's some Homeric hymns there and some things from Hesiod, but there are also ones from sources I'd never even heard of. In many cases, they're ones they're just fragments. When you think of fragments, you think, oh, they must have discovered some sort of piece of parchment or papyrus somewhere. It's really a fragment when you talk about it from ancient Greece and Rome. It's really someone quoted someone somewhere, and maybe that's all we have of this particular person, just one quotation. But that one quotation might be pretty darn important. But where are you going to find that? You know, you're not going to find one book that's just one fragment. So a book like this can be really quite important. I've learned an awful lot from it. So I'm very highly recommending this particular book there. Again, information in the description. From Greece, we don't just have text, of course. We have an awful lot of art. A lot of the art you're going to find in books is being treated from the point of view of the history of art, but you're going to be wanting to look at it from the point of view of the history of myth and religion. I found this particular book, I just sort of ran across it, Art and Myth in Ancient Greece. I'm sure there are plenty of other books on the topic. This is one that I just happened to run across. It dealt with the question of art from the point of view of the myths that are represented in it. Most of the artwork that we have in ancient Greece, on the pottery especially, were representations of myths. Sometimes they're even very helpfully labeled. as to who the characters are. I actually learned of some myths that I had never heard of from some of these pieces of art. So this is actually another form of primary sources, artwork. So if you can find this one, you might find this one useful. Otherwise, just go look through various art sections in libraries and in bookstores and see what you can find. Look for ones that tell you more about the mythology than about the actual art. Okay, now we come to sort of an overlap. This is the Greek Myths by Robert Graves. It's 2 volumes in the Penguin edition here. What he's done is list the myths by themes. He'll list a story of a particular date or a particular occasion, and he'll give the variants. Aristophanes says this, and Euripides says that, and so on. And that's really great, because not only do you get the feel that there are lots of variants, but it tells you where to look those variants up. One thing to really be concerned about with this book is he also gives his own interpretations of those myths, and those interpretations are based on some really shaky, well, let's just say made up, insane etymologies. So each section also has his own interpretations of it. If you read this book, and I do recommend that you read this book, completely ignore those sections. You not only learn nothing, you'll actually learn some bad stuff, which then you'll have to forget, and might confuse in your head with stuff that's important. So really watch out for that stuff. Nothing of what he says based on that is at all reliable. I've seen this book referenced in some very serious scholarly work, but I've never seen any of the other his own speculations referenced. It's just been referenced as a useful source. So now let me turn to some secondary works. Greek Religion by Walter Burkert. This is the book that you have to read. It's one of those books where you might as well underline the things that aren't important in it. There's just that much in it that's useful. It's somewhat old, from 1977, but it's just so jam-packed and it's so authoritative that it has to be read. You have to be familiar with this. Even things that disagree with it have to disagree with it. It has to be dealt with even by people who think it's wrong. It's organized by topic. There are sections on individual deities. There are sections on cult. It's just a beautifully written book. It reads very well. I just highly, highly recommend it. Like I said, it is a little out of date. Its biggest problem is that he deals mostly with the texts, to a lesser extent with the artwork. Because of dealing with the text, he's mostly dealing with Athenian religion, and he's mostly dealing with a very stylized religion, and therefore ends up with a fairly simplified form of the religion. So since he wrote, there's been a lot more work done using the artwork and inscriptions, including particularly what are called the Sacrificial Calendars. And those are just what it sounds like. It's on this particular date, these particular animals are sacrificed to these particular gods. And the Sacrificial Calendars include other things. But the result of all this work that's been done, and also includes a lot more archaeological material, has been a realization that Greek religion was a lot more complicated than Burkert realized. So there's been some corrective work done on them. This particular book on Greek religion by Robert Parker does some of that corrective work. This is from 2011, so it's a very recent book. Among other things, for instance, he talks about how Burkert's conception of the distinction between the cult to the deities and the cult to the ancestors wasn't quite as, the differences weren't quite as clear-cut as Burkert makes them out to be. There are some other distinctions. He talks a lot about what it's like to have a religion with no actual central authority. It's really good for just understanding paganism in general. It's very well written. If nothing else, it's got some really good sources in there, very up to date, so it'd be a good place to find out what's been done in very recent years. So with these two together, Burkert and Parker will give you a good idea of what's out there and where to go from here. One last book I want to show you. It's called The Cult of Pan in Ancient Greece by Philippe Bozo. It's translated from the French. it is just what it says. It's the cult of Pan in ancient Greece. It starts out with the origins of the cult of Pan in ancient Arcadia, when he was worshipped in the form of actually a goat, and then all the way up, not just in Greece, but into Rome, where he became very human with just the slightest traces of horns there. So it traces his development from a very animalistic form into a more human form, traces his transformation in the beliefs in his cult, and so on. If you're interested in Pan, of course, this is the classic book on the topic. It's useful even if you're not really interested in Pan. If you're interested in him somewhat, you still should read it. But what's good about it is it helps you understand that when someone says the Greeks believed, the Greeks worshipped, the Greeks did this, the question should come into your mind of which Greeks, when, where. This really shows you how these things changed over time and were different in different places. As Parker shows us, it's a lot more complicated than that. In fact, the one thing that you learn if you study any academic field is that whenever anybody says something that sounds at all authoritative, the proper answer is, it's a little more complicated than that. And I think that if you read these books, that eventually that's what you're going to learn. In a way, you're going to find out that you know less than when you started, and you're going to find out it's a little more complicated than that. But that's when you start to realize that you know more, and that's when you start to realize that there's a lot more that you don't know. So give these books a chance. Give me write any comments you might have. Ask me any questions about any books you might have read, books that you wonder what I think of. And if you have any more questions, if you have any suggestions of your own books, please put them in the suggestion section, and let's get some sort of conversation going. Thank you.